The first sign something was wrong came when a woman in a blazer marked Property Sovereignty Enforcement stepped out of a boat and onto my dock like she was serving a royal summons. Behind her, 4 others in matching windbreakers and clipboards climbed ashore, one holding a laminated map, another with a portable printer. "Sir," said the lead agent, "this land is under HOA reclamation. You're trespassing." I blinked. This was my cabin, my dock, my grandfather's land. No HOA had ever existed here. They didn't know who they were messing with. I cracked open a beer, leaned on the railing, and smiled. "Y'all brought a printer. Cute." My name's Greg Marsh, and I'd spent most of my life in software development, and exactly none of it in HOA meetings. After my 3rd startup exit, I bought my dream cabin on Otterjaw Lake, near the sleepy mountain town of Dusk. It was remote, quiet, borderline feral. Exactly what I wanted. Until Cheryl Dunst, president of the Twin Pines Homeowners Alliance, a quote-unquote high-end rustic community 3 miles up the road, decided my lakefront property looked like it should belong to them. Cheryl was a former real estate agent turned self-declared land curator with a Bluetooth headset permanently affixed and a vision of expanding HOA jurisdiction across the entire watershed. I, unfortunately, had the only non-HOA property on the lake. This was unacceptable to her. First, Cheryl sent letters, lots of them. They arrived in wax-sealed envelopes stamped TPHA Executive Committee. Unpermitted dock architecture. Unauthorized chimney smoke density. Failure to display HOA-issued lake flag. I ignored them all. Then came the wellness checks. HOA agents in canoes circling my property with binoculars, citing environmental inconsistencies. One afternoon, a drone flew into my screened porch. It was broadcasting HOA bylaws via loudspeaker with this tinny, robotic voice that kept repeating Section 12-4 about mandatory lawn height requirements. I filed a cease and desist. Cheryl responded with what she called a cease and persist, which isn't even a real legal document. The harassment escalated week by week. They started leaving violation notices on my boat, my truck, even taped one to my golden retriever when he wandered too close to their property line during his morning walk. Each notice became more absurd than the last. Excessive bird feeder capacity. Non-conforming firewood stack pattern. Unapproved fish species in personal watercraft live well. Cheryl even hired a consultant she called a lake aesthetic specialist, who was really just her nephew fresh out of community college with a business degree. He would paddle by every morning at exactly 7:15, taking photos with a telephoto lens and making notes on a clipboard that had Twin Pines Authority printed in Comic Sans font. One morning, I caught him trying to measure the angle of my hammock relative to true north, claiming it violated the HOA's recreational equipment positioning guidelines. The psychological warfare extended to my mailbox, which suddenly became flooded with HOA newsletters featuring my property in the Hall of Shame section. They'd photoshopped red circles around completely normal things like my canoe rack, my compost bin, and even a family of ducks that regularly visited my dock. The caption read "Ongoing violations at Rogue Property," accompanied by a lengthy editorial. Cheryl wrote about the importance of lakefront unity and the dangers of what she called aesthetic anarchy. Finally, she declared my land annexed and claimed it had been miszoned decades ago. She sent me a 47-page document filled with legal-sounding gibberish and references to the Greater Twin Pines Expansion Charter, which I later discovered she'd written herself on Microsoft Word the previous Tuesday. The 5 agents arriving by boat were the final straw. They came armed with folders, fake deeds, and a court summons signed by Judge Harmon, who, I discovered with a quick Google search, was not a real judge, but Cheryl's brother-in-law who runs a pest control business called Harmon's Harmonious Home Solutions. They nailed an eviction for reclamation notice to my cabin door with actual nails, damaging the 100-year-old cedar. I invited them in for coffee, speaking in the calmest tone I could muster. They seemed confused by my hospitality, shuffling nervously as they entered my living room. While they stood there awkwardly holding their fake documents, I walked to the dusty safe in the wall and pulled out the original 1948 deed signed by the state governor himself, complete with territorial maps and the founding surveyor's signature. Then, because I never fully retired from tech, I opened my laptop and accessed the county GIS database, pulling up the zoning history of the area on my 70-inch TV screen. The lead agent's face went pale as she watched me navigate through decades of official records. My land had never ever fallen under HOA jurisdiction. In fact, it was zoned as untouchable historical homestead, a designation created specifically to protect properties like mine from exactly this kind of encroachment. Which meant I could basically build a fireworks warehouse if I wanted, and no HOA could say a word about it. I forwarded all this to the real county registrar, who responded within hours with genuine alarm in his email. Turns out, Cheryl had submitted multiple false documents claiming jurisdictional influence over surrounding parcels. That triggered a full audit that spiraled faster than Cheryl could say homeowners covenant. The county sent investigators who arrived in official vehicles with actual government plates, not the magnetic decal Cheryl had been slapping on her Lexus. Then the state land office got involved, sending their own team of surveyors who spent 3 days measuring every inch of the disputed territory. Then, for good measure, the Environmental Protection Agency showed up because I casually mentioned to the county investigator that the HOA agents had dumped printer ink into the lake while trying to print their fake eviction notice on my dock. Cheryl tried to backpedal with the desperation of someone watching their house of cards collapse in slow motion. She called me 17 times in one afternoon, each voicemail more frantic than the last. First, she claimed it was all a misunderstanding. Then she said it was an administrative error. By the 10th message, she was offering me honorary HOA membership with waived fees for life if I just call off the investigation. But the web was unraveling, and every thread led back to her. The investigators found she'd been running this scheme for years, attempting to absorb non-HOA properties through intimidation and forged documents. She'd successfully annexed 3 properties before trying mine, and those previous owners were now coming forward with their own complaints. One elderly couple, the Thompsons, testified that Cheryl had convinced them their property had always been part of the HOA by showing them doctored historical maps where she'd literally used Microsoft Paint to extend the HOA boundaries. They'd been paying dues for 2 years before realizing the scam. Another victim, a young teacher named Marcus, revealed that Cheryl had threatened to report his kayak rental side business as an illegal commercial operation unless he voluntarily joined the HOA. He had recordings of her saying, "You can either pay $300 in monthly dues or I'll make sure the zoning board shuts you down by Monday." The investigation also uncovered Cheryl's shadow corporation, Dunst Development Solutions LLC, which she used to purchase properties that had been harassed into selling at below-market prices. She'd then flipped these properties to HOA members at inflated rates, pocketing the difference. The FBI's white-collar crime division became interested when they discovered she'd crossed state lines to deposit these profits in accounts under her maiden name. The state attorney's office got involved when they discovered she'd been using her position to funnel HOA funds into her personal accounts under the guise of administrative expenses. Those matching windbreakers her agents wore? Purchased with embezzled HOA dues and embroidered at her cousin's shop at 3 times the market rate. At her hearing, Cheryl stood before the judge, the real judge this time, wearing the same property sovereignty enforcement blazer she'd worn to my dock. She insisted with a straight face that it was performance art about civic boundaries. The judge didn't laugh. The prosecutor presented evidence after evidence of her fraudulent activities, each document projection on the courtroom screen making her sink lower in her chair. When they played the drone footage she'd illegally recorded of my property, complete with her voice narrating all the violations she was planning to fabricate, several HOA board members in attendance gasped audibly. Her own recording included her saying, and I quote, "We'll make up whatever violations we need to force him out." Nobody refuses Cheryl Dunst's expansion vision. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Cheryl was hit with 6 counts of document falsification, impersonating a government entity, and unauthorized land claim attempts. The sentence was delivered in a tone that suggested the judge had seen enough of these power-hungry HOA presidents to last a lifetime. 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service specifically helping elderly residents fight HOA overreach, and a $50,000 fine payable to the state. She was also permanently barred from serving on any HOA board, property management company, or any position of authority over residential properties within state lines. But the cherry on top came when the Twin Pines HOA board held an emergency meeting that very evening. With Cheryl's fraudulent activities exposed, they voted unanimously to remove her immediately, retroactively nullify all her expansion attempts, and issue formal apologies to every property owner she'd harassed. The board member reading the decision could barely contain his satisfaction as he announced that Cheryl would also be personally liable for the HOA's $175,000 legal fees. Cheryl's face turned 3 shades of purple as she stood up and screamed that they couldn't do this to her, that Twin Pines was her vision, her creation, her kingdom. Security had to escort her out as she shouted about appealing to the Supreme HOA Council, which, like most things Cheryl referenced, doesn't actually exist.